Okay, I'm going to do 10 minutes on the quantity theory of money. Someone's asked me to do something on it. So the quantity theory of money, at heart, is based on something relatively simple. Quantity theory of money is based on something called the Fischer Equation. The Fischer Equation of exchange. And this is essentially quite uncontroversial, the Fischer Equation. Basically, it says, suppose you take the money stock, so literally the amount of money that there is, say in cash is a simple way of thinking about it. You multiply that by the velocity of circulation. What Fischer said is that'll give you something. So we take the amount. Let's suppose that we have 50 billion pounds. The velocity of circulation shows how many times, say, in a year it's spent. Let's suppose that it's spent 10 times the money stock. You multiply those two together, and you'll get 500 billion pounds. So what must that be? The amount of money times the number of times it's spent. That must be expenditure. And expenditure is just GDP. We can measure GDP in a variety of ways. I'll show you how in a minute. But essentially, that's GDP. He said, well, that's one way in which we could break down GDP. We could say it's the money stock times the velocity of circulation. But he also said, well, GDP is just the price level times output. Price times output. Price times constant. So if the price of the OA data does it? We can see that the price times quantity is also going to be expenditure, which is, as we said, a way of measuring nominal GDP. So what we're saying is that we can measure nominal GDP. We can measure GDP in today's prices, which is what nominal means. In two different ways. We could break it down into saying, well, look, 500 billion pounds. If there's 50 billion pounds of money stock, that money stock must have been spent 10 times to make 500 billion. Or we could break it down into price times constant. So the essence of it is pretty simple. You've got something that reflects prices, something that reflects, the idea of quantity is it reflects real GDP. So the actual level of output in the economy. We've got the money stock and we've got the velocity of circulation. Well, the quantity theory says, well, look, what the quantity theorists do is they introduce causation into this. So they say that m times v equals p times. The letter you'll see at the end varies according to which version of the model you've got. You'll see t, you'll see y, you'll see q. The point is the last thing, just reflects real output in the economy, real GDP. So it doesn't matter too much which letter you choose. But what the quantity theorists say is that an increase in m leads to an increase in p. And we can see this, if you look at charts, you can see that there are pretty strong correlations. And what we need to think about is a little bit about why. And what we've got to think about is, well, how does the money supply increase? One is that the money supply could increase directly. So this would be something like Zimbabwe, under Mugabe. It's what Friedman called helicopter money. And basically, you print money as a government and you spend it. Obviously, what that's going to do is you're going to increase aggregate demand. Or two, it could happen indirectly. So this would be QE. I'm not going to go into the QE process here. But what we know is that by the government creating electronically new money and buying bonds with it, it drives up drives up the money supply. It leads to an increase in asset prices, and it leads to a decrease in bond yields. And the impact of all that, and we've talked about this elsewhere, is also going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. So the point is that if the money supply goes up, then the first thing that happens is what it should do is it should increase aggregate demand. And what the quantity theorists say is, what they say is, well, look, if the money supply goes up, suppose that V stays approximately the same. Yeah, so there's more money, and all that happens is that it's spent. Yeah, so that's constant. Then that's going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. What will an increase in aggregate demand do? Well, it depends on your perspective. But if you're a neoclassical economist, then you know that the economy is close to capacity. Yeah, so therefore, Q isn't going to increase. That's also constant, because, or at least we're going to return to some sort of long-run equilibrium. With neoclassical, that's either constant or slow to grow. And remember, we won't be in recession because the economy will already have recovered from that. So there's an increase in aggregate demand. That's going to lead to, therefore, an increase in the price level, because long-run aggregate supply function looks like that. An increase in aggregate demand eventually leads to the economy self-stabilizing at a higher price level. And that's the essence of the quantity theory, that an increase in aggregate demand, an increase in the money supply increases aggregate demand. An increase in aggregate demand, if the capacity of the economy can't increase, then that's going to lead to more inflation. But of course, we can see that we've done huge amounts of QE across the entire world over the last sort of, where are we now? Sort of 10, 15 years, and it hasn't led to much actual inflation. There's some coming now, but that's more kind of supply side issues. So kind of shortage of labour and so on. So why is that true? Does that mean the quantity theory is wrong? Well, it doesn't mean that the Fischer equation is wrong. But what it means is, obviously, we said that their version, the quantity theorists, is that an increase in M leads to an increase in P. And I think we can see two alternative things that could happen. So one thing that could happen is that suppose an increase in the money supply in recession, or in some sort of financial crisis. Well, maybe that money isn't going to, especially via QE, maybe that money's not going to get lent. Maybe it's not going to make its way into circulation. There's a risk that the money simply gets stuck in the banks. Banks don't want to lend, they're not confident, people don't want to borrow. So then there's no increase in aggregate demand. And the way we would reflect that in the formula is that there's an increase in the money supply, but nobody uses it, so the rate at which money is being pushed around the economy, the velocity of circulation simply drops. So we have more money working less hard. In our original example, we had the money supply is 50 billion and the velocity of circulation was 10. But if all that happens is we increase the money supply to 100 billion and the velocity of circulation drops to 5, then total expenditure is going to remain the same. So one thing that could happen is that an increase in money supply simply has no real effect on aggregate demand. The other one, obviously, is we've assumed a neoclassical model here, but in reality, it's entirely possible that, again, an increase in the money supply in recession, it could increase aggregate demand. But instead of increasing the price level, what it could do is it could simply lead to an increase in GDP. We can say that if there's a negative output gap, if there's spare capacity in the economy, then we'll end up in some sort of Keynesian scenario, where we've got real GDP here, price level here, we've got some sort of aggregate supply function like that. AD increases from AD1 to AD2, and instead of the price level going up, what happens is we get an increase in GDP because there's spare capacity. So therefore, the Fischer equation is right, but it's not necessarily the case that an increase in the money supply is going to lead automatically to an increase in the price level. So the quantity theory says MV equals PQ. They say that an increase in M leads to an increase in P. But we've got two alternatives. Alternative one is that an increase in M is simply cancelled out by a decrease in V. Or alternative two is that an increase in M, V is the same, instead leads to an increase in real GDP if there is spare capacity in the economy.